Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what happened this week in Ohio, where a referendum on a procedural change to the Constitution gave conservatives some dire thoughts about what's going to happen in November and maybe what's going to happen in 2024. Michael New joins us to tell us all to take a deep breath, man, and just relax. Michael New is, of course, assistant professor of practice at the Catholic University of America and senior associate scholar at the Charlotte Lozier Institute, as well as a contributor to National Review Online, where he had actually a pretty good analysis of this up on Wednesday. Michael, welcome back.
Thanks for having me. Much appreciated.
Yeah, look, I mean, I wasn't going to commit seppuku when I saw what happened in Ohio on Tuesday, but I mean, this is worrisome, right? I mean, it does seem that this, first off, I guess you should probably explain what this ballot initiative was and why it has pro-life activists in Ohio and elsewhere a little concerned.
Sure. Just taking a step back. I mean, yesterday, voters in Ohio had the chance to vote on something called Issue 1. And what Issue 1 would do, kind of its main component, was it would kind of set a higher threshold to amend the Ohio state constitution. Right now, the constitution can be amended with 50% plus one of the popular vote. This would raise the threshold, or Issue 1 would have raised the threshold to 60%. And this just makes sense. I mean, constitutions are important. They're durable. They're hard to change. So if you're going to change the Constitution, I think a lot of us would agree it should require a pretty high threshold. It should require a broad consensus. The U.S. Constitution is very hard to change. It's only been amended some 27 times in the past 200 plus years. So this was a perfectly kind of reasonable thing for not only just conservatives and pro-lifers, but everyone. This was of particular interest to people in the pro-life movement and the pro-life community because in November there's going to be a petition on the ballot, a constitutional amendment on the ballot that would place abortion rights in Ohio's state constitution. And essentially, it becomes much harder for our opponents to get 60% of the vote than 50% plus one. So that really did motivate a lot of the support for Issue 1, that we really wanted to make it harder for opponents to amend the Constitution to put abortion rights in the state constitution. And what our opponents want is, frankly, pretty radical. If this abortion amendment comes through, it very likely is going to require or mandate abortion be legal throughout all 9 months of pregnancy. It's going to jeopardize the pro-life parental involvement law in Ohio. It also will probably likely require the Ohio State Medicaid program to start covering abortions. That's going to require taxpayer funding of elective abortions for Ohio residents. So essentially, we wanted to stop this. And again, we were hoping that Issue 1 would pass. Unfortunately, it did not. It got about 43% of the vote, short of the 50% it needed. So it did not pass. And, today is another day. The status quo prevails. And as I said in my blog post, it was a disappointment and it was a setback. We shouldn't despair.
So it's a setback, though. I mean, I think everybody else, I think that's at least accurate. It's a setback. And I agree with you. I mean, I think that when you're amending constitutions, it's different than passing statutory law. It's even different than doing referendums that create statutory law. I mean, that you can say, well, look, it's, majority rules on those things, but constitutions are more foundational.
Right, absolutely.
And certainly with our federal constitution, it's been made, I wouldn't say extremely difficult, but somewhat difficult to amend the federal constitution. We've certainly done it in the past. We've done it most recently, I think, 30 years ago, I think was the last time we amended the Constitution, by having supermajorities in both chambers of Congress pass the issue to the states, or to have an Article 5 convention pass it to the states, then requiring a 3/4 majority of the states to ratify it in order for it to become an official amendment. And what that does is it makes sure that you're not putting the whims of the moment, enshrining the whims of the moment into your foundational document. When you have that sort of agreement where you can have 60% or 2/3, I mean, 60% is still a pretty big threshold right now. And in the way that, in our current political climate, I mean, then you're talking about something that has broad consensus that everybody can really agree on foundationally. Abortion clearly isn't one of those issues. And
You're
so,
right.
yeah.
I mean, right. Essentially, with 60%, it's going to be bipartisan. It's just one party just can't ram a constitutional amendment through that the other party hates. You have to at least have some kind of bipartisan support for anything to reach that 60% threshold. And again, it's one thing to pass a law or a statute that can be easily amended or repealed, but the Constitution is going to be pretty permanent. So when you're talking about making a permanent change to your governing document, that should require a pretty broad consensus.
Well, and I would think that under normal circumstances, or maybe if there wasn't a pending divisive issue on the table, that was something that would have normally passed, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I kind of get that impression. Now, we do have a divisive issue, abortion. We've been talking about this. Well, it's also a summer election, right? Mm-hmm. So the skeptic in me is saying it's a summer election and an off year, right? Because Ohio's not New Jersey or Virginia, or what's the other one? I think it's Missouri that has off year state, constitutional office elections. Or I think it's Mississippi. Excuse me. I think it's Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And so Ohio doesn't do that. So if you're doing these types of referendums or ballot initiatives in an off year in the summertime rather than November, I'm always skeptical that you can read too much into that, which is one of the reasons why, I was concerned, but not necessarily panicking at the outcome of this. This is a type of election. I mean, certainly normally scheduled, but it's a type of election where grassroots turnout probably has a lot greater impact than it does when you get to a normal November cycle, and especially a normal cycle in, in a full election year, where you're going to have just more turnout because it's just more establishment turnout. People know that they're expected to cast ballots at those times. How much do you read into that? I mean, how much participation was there in this election?
I mean, the turnout was higher than expected for special elections. I mean, usually off-year elections don't see much in the way of turnout. Usually summer elections, don't see much in the way of turnout, at least low turnout rates. I mean, I think the turnout was higher than expected. I don't really have the final data from the Ohio Secretary of State's office, but again, I do think the fact that abortion was a key issue of this campaign, and both pro-life groups and groups to support legal abortion were motivated and energized. I think that, and the thing also got lots of coverage both locally and even nationally. I mean, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post were running stories about this election. Turnout was high for a kind of a summer special election. So, but then again, it probably was still lower than what you'd expect for a midterm election. Certainly lower than for a presidential election. So again, I'm concerned, as we'll probably talk about later. I'm not panicking. I still think there is a pathway to victory for pro-lifers in November.
We are going to get to that because you have a really interesting analysis, and I'm not sure I completely buy it, but it's very interesting, and it's at least something that we need to be considering, right? Some of the things that you raised. But before we get there, yes, I saw on Tuesday, there was anecdotal reports of much longer lines in urban centers than what was expected. And I said at the time, well, if that's where you're getting turnout, it's not looking good. And it turned out that was correct. On the other hand, still 43%, right? So clearly you're getting turnout in other places. But it does raise a question because and this is something that's come up since the midterms last year, when after Dobbs, the issue of abortion really prior to Dobbs was, I don't want to say academic. Academic may be a little too strong a term for it, but basically there weren't a lot of stakes in most of the abortion debates in terms of electoral politics, right? Because as long as Roe and Casey were in place, individual politicians really couldn't do a hell of a lot of it. They could fulminate about it. It was more of a partisan marker, right? A cultural marker. After Dobbs, though, these questions are now acute, and Republicans think that was part of what happened in the midterms, was that abortion turned out to be a much stronger incentive for Democrats and abortion rights moderates to come out and vote, and the Republicans didn't have an answer for it then. is this more of that? I mean, is this more evidence that that's the case? And this is going to be just a significant headwind for Republicans now for the next few election cycles.
I mean, I think there are some states and some districts where it may well hurt Republicans. But I mean, one thing I'd also say from the 2022 elections, pro-life governors who signed strong pro-life laws, they did very well. And
Yeah.
many faced, well-financed opponents. I mean, Greg Abbott of Texas won by a large margin. The governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, won by a large margin. In Ohio, Mike DeWine won by a large margin. So, I mean, there were pro-life governors. I'm sorry?
DeSantis had actually signed abortion legislation, won by 19 points in Florida. I mean,
absolutely.
Right,
I mean, the governors who did sign laws, certainly weren't punished, and in many cases won by, pretty substantial margins. Again, what we see from the data, at least the data I've seen, is that I don't think public opinion has changed that dramatically on this issue, but the other side is more amped up and more motivated. And people who support legal abortion are now more likely to support candidates who support legal abortion. We're not getting like crossover voters the way we sometimes did. So I think the other side certainly is more motivated than they used to be. And again, there are certain circumstances and certain races where it probably has hurt Republicans and has hurt pro-lifers. But I don't necessarily think it's a losing issue across the board. I think that when you make a strong argument in favor of the pro-life position, people are often very receptive. So I just think that, the ostrich strategy of sticking your head in the sand doesn't work. I think we have good arguments. I just think we need to make those arguments and make them in a compelling, convincing way.
And I'm glad you brought up the ostrich strategy, because honestly, and I'm biased because I'm very much opposed to abortion, and I actually am very happy that these new restrictions are rolling in. Now, my political analyst side of me says neither party is really finding the middle on this yet. But, as somebody who just hates abortion and thinks it's the killing of human life, I'm happy to have those things restricted, and think it's worth a couple of losses to have to save those lives. But putting my political analyst hat back on, one of the things that I saw was that Republicans hadn't prepared themselves very well for Dobbs. I don't know why, because frankly, they had about a 4-week run up to it between the leak and the actual, 5 weeks, I think, between the leak and the actual release of the opinion. But they seem to come out of the gate kind of shooting the moon for, restrictions and talking about all these different laws they were going to pass, realizing that they were kind of spooking the electorate. And then they just shut down and didn't want to talk about it at all, and left the field open for Democrats to completely frame that particular issue in the election. And my impression in Ohio is that wasn't the case in Ohio. But I think that that's still a problem, that Republicans are not articulating compelling arguments in some cases. I don't know about Ohio, because like you said, Mike DeWine did really well in Ohio. But I think that that's part of the problem. They're leaving a vacuum there. I just ask you, did you see that as an issue in Ohio in this election, or do you think that they made a pretty good showing of making the argument?
Couple things. First, I wouldn't even argue Republicans had more than just 4 weeks. Republicans kind of knew when Amy Coney Barrett, was on the Supreme Court, there's a good chance that Roe v. Wade was going to, be overturned. They also knew with the oral arguments in early December, they went well for us, in the Dobbs case. I mean, it wasn't a sure thing the Roe be overturned, but those of us who, read the transcript and saw what happened knew that, it was probably going to be a pretty good decision for pro-lifers that day in June, which it was. So Republicans had plenty of time to prepare. And I think that, out of the gate, preparation was lacking. I don't think there was any kind of a coherent strategy, either at the federal level or at the state level. It was all very kind of, scattershot. And, it was kind of okay in very conservative states. They had trigger laws in place, or they could pass laws right away. I mean, certainly elected officials in Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, they're doing just well, happily passing pro-life laws and protecting preborn children. But in more kind of moderate states, places like Ohio, places like Michigan, a better, more coherent strategy would have been helpful. And, I think we've learned, some things from these direct democracy campaigns. I think that, the Ohio campaign was a little bit complicated because even though, it was about abortion, it wasn't just about abortion. It was about a procedural threshold and There were groups, not necessarily interested in sanctity of life issues that were involving themselves in this campaign. So again, it was, a good idea. I think just, requiring that constitutional amendments, have a larger consensus to, be enacted. I do think that, pro-lifers seemed organized and were, running ads and were on the ground. And they did have a rally that last weekend with, Abby Johnson and Bishop Strickland and Jim Caviezel. So it seemed that, there was an organized campaign. Again, I don't like to read, too much into the results of, any one election. Again, this was partly about abortion, but not entirely about it. The good news is tomorrow is another day. And again, I do think there's a pathway to victory for Ohio pro-lifers in November.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, this was the point that you were raising at National Review. You're arguing here that that time is kind of on our side. That this is sort of like an opening battle, not the war, and that time is on our side. So, explain what you're thinking about that and how you see this progressing as we get down to there's another vote coming up in November, right, on this.
Right, that the actual vote on the amendment to place abortion in the Ohio State Constitution will take place in November. And one thing I'm just encouraging people is don't give up. There is, I think, a pathway to victory. It's not going to be easy, but it's not impossible. And this is kind of my reasoning that right now polling on the abortion amendment shows it's polling anywhere from 54% to 57%, which is, of course, a majority. But one thing I'll say is that polls taken months before the election are really not always good predictors of what happens on election day, especially with ballot proposals. There's a good body of research showing that ballot proposals tend to lose support as election day draws near. And there's at least two good examples I can think of. First is Michigan. They had on the ballot, Proposition 3 or Proposal 3 in 2022. Opposition to Proposal 3 was in the mid-20s in September. It turns out on election day, over 43% of Michigan voters, again, over 43% voted against Proposition 3. Now, that wasn't the win we wanted. We did gain about, 16, 17, 18% of the polls in about a month and a half. If we make a similar gain in Ohio, that puts us within striking distance of victory. I think an even better example is Massachusetts. 2012, there was a ballot proposition in the Bay State to legalize assisted suicide. Everyone thought it'd be a big slam dunk. Opponents, didn't seem well organized. Opponents didn't seem well funded. Pro-lifers in blue states, just sometimes, have trouble with just, fundraising and organization. And opposition to this, assisted suicide measure was polling around in the mid-20s in like August. In November, the pro-life team won. We got 51% of the vote and beat assisted suicide in Massachusetts. So if we can win and make up 25 plus points in dark blue Massachusetts, I think we can make up some ground in Ohio. It's not going to be easy. I think we're going to have to spend money. We're going to have to raise money. I think a grassroots effort is going to be crucial. You just can't fight this behind your desk. People need to be out there knocking on doors, pestering friends and neighbors to go out and vote. I mean, this is going to require a full court press, but I don't think it's impossible. And again, I think it's worth it. I think if, we lose Ohio, the other side's going to start doing these propositions in places like Arizona, Florida, Missouri. And again, that's just going to encourage and enable our opponents. I think a win in Ohio is going to get national ramifications.
Well, I also think it's going to be helped in another regard too, right? Because as you said earlier, and you intimated this earlier, so it's not as though you haven't addressed this, but the fight this week was about constitutional process, right? It was a proxy fight for what's coming up in November. It's clearly a proxy fight, right? That was clear. But there's a lot of stuff that went into that. I think when you get to the Ohio ballot and the question in the November Ohio ballot that says, should abortion be a constitutional right, regardless of how it's framed, that makes the issue, I think, less procedural and more definitional than what we had this week. And again, Ohio is not Massachusetts. Ohio is not even Michigan, really. I mean, Ohio is redder than Michigan is. And so I have a sneaking suspicion that maybe they didn't want to, maybe some Ohioans who don't want abortion just simply didn't want to monkey around with the constitutional process as an end run around this, but are simply not going to turn out and vote to put abortion in the state constitution as a constitutional right, which would put it somewhat beyond any sort of control whatsoever. And I don't know how it's written. You probably have a better grip on how it's written for the November ballot. But if it's written the way that Democrats keep wanting to sell this, starting in May of last year when Dobbs was handed down, they're selling this as there's no such thing as a legitimate restriction on abortion. I don't know a Democratic politician that's actually put forward legislation on this that has agreed to put any sort of restriction on abortion. And if that's the way that this thing reads, I think there's going to be a lot of people that say, hey, look, dude, it's one thing to say, monkey around with the constitutional amendment process. Maybe we don't want to do that, but we also don't want to lose some input on how this, public policy is going to be implemented. So I think that there's some room there to argue that as well, is that, that type of constitutional amendment will make it almost impossible to put any sort of restrictions on it, whether that be, restrictions on parental notification, whether that be restrictions based on, the term of gestation, any of that. And I think that might be something that wasn't a factor this week, but will be when the question becomes acute in November.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that, certainly pro-lifers, I think, are going to make some very strong arguments against this constitutional amendment. I mean, we had a proxy fight, but the campaign about this amendment, in my opinion, has not really begun in earnest just yet. And I think that, again, very likely this amendment would effectively legalize abortion throughout all 9 months of pregnancy and put that in the Constitution. That's unpopular. Second, third trimester abortions don't pull well, and they certainly don't pull well in Ohio. I think this would also jeopardize Ohio's pro-life parental involvement law. Again, parental involvement laws pull very well. Most people do think minor girls should at least notify or receive permission from their parents for obtaining an abortion. I think there's also a good chance this constitutional amendment would require Ohio's Medicaid program to cover abortions. That would mean Ohio taxpayers would have to start paying for elective abortions. And the one slogan I'm encouraging opponents of this amendment to use is calling it the abortion tax increase. I think that's what we should say from now until Election Day. So again, I think we have some very powerful arguments against this. Again, we have our work cut out for us. The other side is motivated, well-funded. But again, this is not an impossible fight. And again, I'm encouraging people in Ohio to, don't despair over what happened yesterday. I'm encouraging pro-lifers elsewhere, support efforts in Ohio, whether it's, with money. I think we're set up. We can do phone banking. I think that'll be set up. We can be done remotely. So again, I think this is winnable, and it's an important fight for pro-lifers to win.
Well, Michael New, I know that you're going to be fighting. You fight this all the time. It's great talking with you again.
Great talking to you too.
Opportunity to do this here. I do it occasionally on the Drew Mariani Show when I fill in on Relevant Radio as well. Don't forget, Michael J. New is assistant professor of practice at the Catholic University of America. I should say the Catholic University of America. That's the way it's supposed to read. And a senior associate scholar at the Charlotte Lozier Institute. His Twitter handle, or is it X handle now? I was on vacation 2 weeks. I don't know what they're calling it these days.
I'm still calling it Twitter.
Yeah, I think so too. At Michael_J_new. And whether you tweet or post, because that's a whole new thing too, you got to be following Michael on Twitter at Michael_J_new. And he's also at the National Review Online, The Corner. Michael, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. Much appreciated. Keep the great work.